Night had fallen over Ndala, cloaking the remote village in darkness, save for the flickering glow of torches scattered around the central hut. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, mingling with the distant aroma of damp earth after the evening's brief rainfall. A restless energy pulsed through the villagers, their murmurs hushed but urgent as they gathered in small clusters outside the healer's dwelling. Inside, beyond the woven grass walls, something unimaginable was unfolding. Siram, the village's most revered healer, worked with steady hands, though a storm brewed behind her aged eyes. She had delivered many children in her lifetime, but never had she seen a birth like this. The woman on the straw mat, Naya, had been in labor for hours, her body drenched in sweat, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Yet, it was not the difficulty of the birth that sent a chill down Siram's spine. It was what she saw when the baby finally emerged into the world. The midwives gasped in unison, their voices catching in their throats. The newborn's skin was golden, not a warm, sun-kissed brown like the people of Ndala, but shimmering, metallic gold, as if the child had been sculpted from the very essence of sunlight. Every inch of him glowed in the dim torchlight, his skin, his hair, his eyelashes, even the tiny crescents of his fingernails. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the wind outside had gone still. Naya, exhausted and weak, lifted her head, her pulse quickening. What is wrong?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Siram hesitated, pressing the child into Naya's arms. "See for yourself," she said, her tone unreadable. Naya's trembling hands closed around the infant. The moment she touched him, a warmth spread through her fingers, like holding a stone that had soaked in the midday sun. She looked down and gasped. The baby was staring up at her, silent, alert, his golden irises reflecting the torchlight like liquid amber. He did not cry. He did not squirm. He simply watched. Outside, the villagers waited anxiously, their whispers growing louder. They had been expecting the wail of a newborn, the familiar sound of life taking its first breath in the world. But instead, there was only silence. A shadow crossed the entrance of the hut. It was Jabari, the village elder, his presence commanding even in the darkness. "Siram," he called, his deep voice steady but firm. "What has happened?" Siram did not respond immediately. Her fingers brushed over the baby's golden forehead, as if confirming that her eyes were not deceiving her. Then, slowly, she stood, her expression unreadable. "The child," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "He is unlike any we have seen before." Jabari stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Siram exhaled. Then, she parted the woven mat that covered the doorway, allowing the torchlight to spill into the hut. "See for yourself." A collective gasp rippled through the villagers. The glow of the baby's skin was unmistakable. It was not a trick of the light, nor the sheen of sweat on a newborn's body. He shone unnatural, ethereal. At first, there was silence. Then, the whispers began. "A sign from the ancestors," someone murmured. "No," another voice countered, sharp with unease. "This is not natural. No child should look like that." Kofi, one of the elder council members, stepped forward, his expression grim. "A child of gold? This is not a blessing. This is an omen." Naya clutched the baby tighter against her chest, fear blooming in her heart. "He is my son," she said, her voice quivering but resolute. "Not a curse." Jabari raised a hand, silencing the rising murmurs. His eyes remained locked onto the child, his mind churning with memories of stories long buried. Legends of golden-skinned beings, of ancient bloodlines that had disappeared long before the founding of Ndala. But those were just stories, weren't they? Siram turned to him, her face lined with something that was not quite fear, but not quite acceptance either. "We must decide what this means," she said softly. Jabari did not answer immediately. His gaze fell on the infant once more, on the way his golden irises reflected the flames outside. The boy was still watching, calm, patient, as if he already knew the questions burning in their minds. And then, finally, the wind returned, howling through the trees like the distant call of something ancient waking from its slumber. Among the villagers frozen in awe and fear stood Abadil, his posture tense, his breath uneven. He had seen many things in the wilderness, predators lurking in the tall grass, storms rolling in like angry spirits, but never had he witnessed something that made his very soul tremble. The golden child. His mind struggled to make sense of it, but his heart reacted before his thoughts could catch up. Something deep within him stirred, a sensation foreign yet familiar, like the whisper of a long-forgotten memory brushing against the edge of his consciousness. His feet moved on their own, carrying him closer to the hut where the mother held her newborn against her chest. The flames from the torches outside reflected in the baby's golden skin, giving the illusion that he was made of fire and light. The infant's eyes, those unnatural, amber-hued irises, locked on Abadil's the moment he stepped forward. It was not the vacant gaze of a newborn. No, this child saw him, saw through him. A strange warmth spread through Abadil's chest, as if something unseen had reached inside him and tethered his soul to the child's. The sensation was unsettling, yet it was not entirely foreign. It was recognition. A soft gasp escaped Naya's lips as she noticed his reaction. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled. "You feel it too, don't you?" Abadil hesitated. His pulse pounded in his ears, his throat dry, yet he managed a slow nod. He didn't know how or why, but he could not deny it. Something about this child had awakened something dormant within him. The air inside the hut was suffocating, thick with unspoken fears and ancient uncertainties. The healer, Siram, had been watching silently from the corner of the room, her fingers gripping the wooden beads around her wrist. Now, she finally spoke, her voice as heavy as the weight settling over them. "This child," she murmured, her gaze flickering between Abadil and the newborn. "He carries an energy we do not understand." The room seemed to contract around them, the crackling of distant torches outside the only sound breaking the silence. Then, Siram's voice turned grave. "And energies that are not understood can be dangerous." The words struck like a cold wind against Abadil's skin, but he did not step back. He should have retreated like the others, should have whispered to himself that this was unnatural, an omen to be feared. But instead, he took another step forward, his fingers instinctively closing around the small pendant hanging from his neck. The pendant, the only thing his parents had left behind before they vanished. Its metal was dull and worn with time, but the inscriptions carved into it had never faded. They had never made sense to him, nor to anyone in the village. Siram had examined it once, years ago, only to shake her head and mutter that it carried something beyond her knowledge. And now, as he stood in front of the golden child, the pendant burned against his skin, hotter than ever before. His heart slammed against his ribs. This was not a coincidence. A sharp intake of breath from Naya pulled him from his thoughts. The baby, silent since his birth, had raised his tiny hand toward him. His golden fingers curled slightly, as if reaching for something unseen. A shiver danced down Abadil's spine. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something vast, something he could not name. Jabari, the village elder, entered the hut at that moment, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight before him. His voice was low, measured. "What is happening here?" Naya's fingers tightened protectively around her child, but she did not answer. Siram did. "There is a bond," the healer said, glancing between Abadil and the infant. "One I do not yet understand." Jabari studied them both, his deep-set eyes betraying no emotion. Then, slowly he turned to Abadil. "What do you feel?" What did he feel? Abadil swallowed, struggling to put into words what made no sense. He felt drawn, as if this child had existed in his life long before this moment, before this night, before this birth. As if the golden glow of his skin, the warmth that emanated from his tiny body, was connected to something buried in Abadil's past, something he had spent his entire life trying to forget. But before he could find his voice, a gust of wind rushed through the entrance of the hut, strong enough to make the flames of the torches dance wildly. The wooden walls creaked, And for a brief moment, the temperature shifted, a brief chill sweeping through the warm night air. A bad omen, or a sign. Abadil was no longer sure which. The sun had barely begun its slow ascent over the horizon when the village council gathered. The early morning air was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. The people of Ndalo whispered among themselves, their voices tense, their eyes clouded with uncertainty. A child like this had never been seen before. A child whose very existence defied the natural order. And when nature is defied, consequences always follow. At the heart of the gathering sat Jabari, the village elder, his expression carved from stone. Deep wrinkles lined his face, each one a mark of the many years he had guided Ndalo through storms, famine, and war. But now, he was faced with a decision unlike any before. His gaze swept over the council members, over the faces of men and women who had lived by the traditions of their ancestors, who feared anything that threatened to unravel those beliefs. "We must decide what to do," he finally said, his voice slow, deliberate. "A child like this has never been seen in Ndalo." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. Then, a voice rose above the rest. "We must return him to the spirits," Kofi declared. The elder's dark eyes burned with conviction. His hands curled into fists. "Golden flesh is unnatural. No human should shine like the gods. He is not one of us." A chill swept through the gathering. Kofi had always been deeply superstitious, a man who saw omens in every shadow, who believed that the ancestors watched over them with eyes that judged harshly. And in his mind, there was no greater sign of divine interference than a child born with skin that glowed like the sun. Naya, who had remained silent until now, tightened her hold on her son. Her fingers trembled, but her voice did not. "He is just a child," she said, her words sharp as a blade. "My child." But Kofi was not swayed. He stepped forward, turning to the council with an air of finality. "We must take him to the jungle. Leave him as an offering. If we do not, we risk bringing disaster upon us all." A stunned silence fell over the gathering. Then, from the opposite side of the circle, another voice rose. Ebony. She was young, younger than most on the council, but her heart was fierce, and her kindness ran deeper than the rivers that fed Ndalo. "You would cast out a newborn?" she challenged, her dark eyes flashing. "You would abandon an innocent child because you fear what you do not understand?" "He is not innocent," Kofi shot back. "He is something else, something that does not belong here." Tension crackled between them like fire in dry grass. The villagers held their breath, torn between fear and reason. Some nodded at Kofi's words, their expressions grim, their own fears reflected in his. Others looked at Ebony, at the defiance in her stance, and felt the first flickers of doubt. Jabari lifted a hand, demanding silence. "Enough." His voice was weary, but it carried the weight of authority. "This decision is not one to be made with anger." But before he could say more, the sky darkened unnaturally. A sudden gust of wind howled through the village, whipping through the gathering with an almost sentient force. The flames of the torches flickered wildly, and the villagers gasped as the earth beneath them trembled, if only for a second. It was as if something unseen was listening. Naya's heart pounded against her ribs. Instinctively, she pressed her child closer to her chest, shielding him from the eyes that burned into her. "The spirits," someone whispered. "They have heard us." Fear took hold. Some backed away, their gazes darting around as if expecting the gods themselves to descend upon them. Kofi stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Jabari's eyes, sharp despite his age, locked onto the golden child. The baby remained silent, his amber eyes unblinking, unafraid. The elder exhaled slowly. "There is no rush to judgment," he said at last. "We do not yet know what this child is, or why he has come." Naya met his gaze, her own filled with silent pleading. "He belongs here," she said, her voice steady. "I will not abandon my son." For the first time, Siriam spoke. The old healer had been quiet through most of the gathering, listening, observing. But now, she stepped forward, her wise eyes filled with something neither fear nor certainty. "Perhaps," she murmured, "he was sent to reveal a truth we have long forgotten." Her words hung in the air, heavy, lingering. No one spoke. No one dared to. The wind died down. The torches steadied, but the unease in the villagers' hearts remained. And somewhere, beyond the village, hidden in the shadows of the jumble, something else stirred, something ancient, something weighty. Sleep did not come easily to Abadil that night. The weight of the day's events pressed heavy against his chest, a relentless presence that refused to let go. He lay on the woven mat inside his hut, his mind restless, his body tense. The golden child, the way the infant had looked at him, as if seeing something no one else could. The way his own pendant had burned against his skin, pulsing with an energy he could not explain. When sleep finally claimed him, it was not the peaceful rest he longed for. Instead, his mind became a battlefield of visions. Flashes of symbols he did not recognize. Ancient markings glowing against the dark sky. Voices, distant but urgent, whispering in a language he had never heard yet somehow understood. A great land swallowed by golden sand. Dunes rising and falling like the breath of a slumbering giant. Structures carved from stone, standing tall beneath an endless sun, only to crumble into dust before his eyes. A single figure, standing in the center of it all, his body shimmering with the same golden light as the child. Then, a sudden jolt. Abadil awoke with a sharp intake of breath, his skin damp with sweat. His heart pounded in his chest, the remnants of the vision still lingering in his mind. But something was different. The darkness of his hut was not complete. A faint glow pulsed beside him. His pendant, it was illuminated from within, casting a dim, golden light onto his hands. The same glow as the baby's skin. A shiver ran down his spine. This was no coincidence. This was a connection, one he could no longer ignore. Determined to uncover the truth, Abadil left his hut before the sun had fully risen. He moved quickly through the village, careful not to draw attention, his thoughts racing ahead of him. There was only one man who might have the answers he sought. Moyali, the old man, lived on the outskirts of Nala, beyond the last row of huts, where the trees grew thick and the land sloped downward toward the river. He was a man of whispers and forgotten knowledge, a keeper of stories that the village had chosen to forget. When Abadil arrived, Moyali was already awake, sitting outside his small dwelling, grinding dried herbs between his palms. His eyes, clouded with age but sharp as ever, lifted the moment he sensed Abadil's presence. "You have seen something," the old man said, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. It was not a question. Abadil hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, unclasping the pendant from his neck and holding it out. "Tell me what this means," he said. "Tell me why it is glowing." Moyali took the pendant carefully, his fingers tracing the worn symbols along its surface. At first he said nothing, but then his breath hitched, his grip tightened. "This is no ordinary charm," he murmured, turning it over, as if searching for something unseen. A deep crease formed between his brows. "This symbol? I've seen it before." Abadil's pulse quickened. "Where?" Moyali looked at him, his gaze unreadable. "In stories. Old stories. Stories of a time before Ndala. Before the villages. Before the world we know." He exhaled slowly. "It is the mark of the children of the sun." The word sent a chill through Abadil's spine. "The children of the sun?" he echoed. Moyali's expression darkened, his hands closing around the pendant as if it might disappear. Long ago, before even the ancestors of Ndala settled here, there were whispers of a people whose bodies shimmered like gold. Beings who walked among men but were not entirely human. They were said to be the last guardians of a power older than the land itself. But they vanished, or so he thought. Abadil's mind raced. The golden child, the way he had looked at him, the dreams, the symbols. "You're saying the child is one of them?" Moyali did not answer immediately. He studied the pendant one last time before pressing it back into Abadil's hands. His voice was heavy with secrets. "If this child has returned," he said, "then something is waking up. His eyes held a warning, and not all things that wake should be welcomed. A gust of wind stirred the trees behind them, sending dry leaves scattering across the ground. The morning light had barely touched the sky, yet the air carried a weight that had nothing to do with the approaching dawn. Abadiel clenched the pendant in his fist, his mind a storm of questions. And deep within him, something whispered that this was only the beginning. By dawn, something was wrong. The air in Dala had changed, thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere had grown dense with something unseen. Even before the first villager stepped outside, they could feel it pressing against their skin, an unnatural heat that did not belong to the morning. The sun had yet to rise fully, and yet the sky bore an eerie glow, neither the soft hues of dawn nor the burning gold of midday. It was something else, something unnatural. Then the earth trembled, a low, rolling tremor, deep like the growl of a great beast waking from a long slumber. Clay pots rattled against wooden shelves, and the dust of the village pathways lifted into the air, swirling in ghostly patterns. The tremor was not strong enough to topple the huts, but it was enough to send panic rippling through the people. One by one, they emerged from their homes, wide-eyed, their voices hushed with unease. Then a scream. It came from the village center, sharp and raw with terror. They rushed toward the sound, their hearts pounding as fear took root in their chests. And there, at the heart of Nala, stood Naya, her arms wrapped protectively around her child. The golden infant did not cry, did not squirm. He was awake, his eyes focused on something above them, something unseen, and his body, his golden skin, was glowing even brighter. A sudden gust of wind swept through the village, lifting the dust from the ground in great swirling columns. The heat intensified. The very air seemed to hum with energy, thick with a presence beyond mortal comprehension. And then, through the rising haze, a shape began to take form. A shadow loomed in the sky. It emerged from the dust like a phantom stepping between worlds, its body immense, its presence suffocating. The villagers fell to their knees, eyes wide with horror. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, tall beyond reason, its body a mass of shifting gold and darkness, as if carved from the sun itself, yet bound by something far older. Its eyes burned like molten fire, vast and knowing, filled with a power that transcended time. When it spoke, the very ground seemed to vibrate beneath them. "You have kept the child." The voice was deep, layered, echoing through the bones of those who heard it. It was neither a question nor an accusation. It was a statement, a truth. And so, the voice rumbled. The cycle begins again. The villagers cowered, their breaths stolen by fear. Some clutched at the earth as if it might anchor them. Others whispered desperate prayers to the ancestors, pleading for protection. Abadiel stood frozen. His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, but his body would not obey. A force unseen held him in place, something ancient and binding. And then, without warning, his pendant pulsed. A sharp, burning sensation shot through his chest, forcing a gasp from his lips. His pendant, dull and worn for so long, was now alive with the same golden glow as the child. It pulsed in time with his racing heartbeat, as if answering an unspoken call. And then, as if pulled by something far beyond his understanding, he stepped forward. The entity's burning gaze shifted, locking onto him. The force that had gripped his body intensified, but Abadiel clenched his fists, forcing his voice to work. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse, his throat dry from the heat. "What does this child mean?" The being did not move, did not waver. But when it spoke again, there was something else in its tone. Something final. "He is the key to restoring what was lost," it said. "Or dooming us all." The word struck like a blow to Abadiel's chest. Restoring, dooming. There was no middle ground, no uncertainty, only a choice. A choice that had somehow been placed in his hands long before he had even been born. The earth trembled once more, and the golden child in Naya's arms blinked, his amber eyes locked onto Abadiel's. Silent, waiting, and for the first time in his life, Abadil felt truly afraid of what lay ahead. Silence fell over Ndala. The earth, which had trembled only moments ago, was now still. The heat that had weighed upon the village, suffocating and relentless, had vanished, replaced by a strange, unnatural calm. The villagers held their breath, their eyes locked onto the scene before them. Naya stood frozen, clutching her child to her chest, her arms trembling not from fear, but from something deeper, something neither she nor anyone else could name. The golden infant, untouched by the chaos around him, was silent as always. But then, for the first time since his birth, he moved. A tiny hand, impossibly steady, reached outward, not toward his mother, not toward the villagers, but toward Abadil. Abadil's breath hitched in his throat. His pulse pounded against his ribs like a war drum. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to resist whatever force was pulling him forward. And yet his feet remained planted. His body refused to move. The child's golden fingers barely brushed against his own. But the moment they did, the world shattered. Vision struck him like a tidal wave, flooding his mind with images beyond comprehension. He saw civilizations long buried beneath the earth, their cities built from gold and stone, stretching endlessly beneath an unforgiving sun. He saw great towers crumble, swallowed by time itself, their history forgotten by all but the wind. He saw people, beings whose skins shimmered like molten metal, standing at the edge of an abyss, their eyes filled with knowledge too vast to contain. He felt their power, their sorrow, their fear, and then he saw himself, not as he was now, but as something else, a figure standing at the threshold of past and future, bound by an invisible thread to the child in his arms. A bridge between two worlds, a choice that had already been made. The visions vanished as abruptly as they had come. Abadil staggered, gasping for breath, his head spinning. His hands trembled at his sides. But something had changed. Something deep inside him had settled. Understanding, his gaze lifted, locking onto the golden entity before him. The being had not moved, its burning eyes watching, waiting. But where before there had been only power and presence, now Abadil saw something else. Expectation. His voice, when it came, was steady, certain. The past is not meant to be repeated. The words left his lips as if they had always belonged to him. The child is not a weapon. He turned, looking at the villagers, at Naya, at Jabari, at Siram, at Kofi, who still clung to fear. He is a bridge. The golden figure remained still for a moment that stretched into eternity. Then slowly it inclined its head. Then the burden of protection falls to you. Abadil did not flinch. He did not hesitate. He simply nodded. And just as suddenly as it had come, the entity was gone. The air lightened. The sky brightened. The earth beneath their feet was no longer restless. It was as if the storm that had threatened to consume Ndala had passed without a single drop of rain. But something had changed. The villagers no longer looked at the child with fear, no longer whispered of curses and omens. Instead, they spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as if the golden infant had come not to bring destruction, but to awaken something long buried within them all. The past had not returned to haunt them. It had returned to remind them. In Abadil had finally found his purpose. From that day forward, he became the guardian of the child who shone like the sun, the one who carried the wisdom of an ancient world in his tiny hands. And as the baby looked up at him, golden eyes filled with wisdom far beyond his years, Abadil knew, with a certainty deeper than blood, that this was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.